The date is Monday, September 2nd, 1940. The time is just past noon in Berlin. Across the German Reich, newspapers trumpet the latest victories. France has been defeated and occupied for nearly 3 months. The British Expeditionary Force, though evacuated from Dunkirk, is shattered, its equipment littering the beaches of northern France. In the Chancellery, Adolf Hitler is at the zenith of his prestige, the master of continental Europe. To the average German citizen, the ***, the factory worker, the shopkeeper, it appears the war is all but over. Rationing, introduced at the outbreak of hostilities, remains relatively mild. There are still consumer goods in the shops. The bombings of German cities by the Royal Air Force, while a disturbing new reality, are still pinpricks compared to what is to come. The concept of total war, the complete mobilization of a nation's entire population, economy, and resources for a fight to the finish, seems a distant, unnecessary specter. The lightning campaigns of the Blitzkrieg had promised short, decisive conflicts that spared the homeland the grueling sacrifices of 1914-1918. Yet within the next 4 years, this same nation would be plunged into a vortex of total mobilization, its cities reduced to rubble, its population subjected to relentless aerial bombardment, and its every human and material resource bent towards a struggle that would end only in absolute ruin. This is the story of how Nazi Germany, despite its ideological fixation on struggle and its early military successes, was profoundly reluctant and ill-prepared for a true total war, and how it was ultimately forced, by the relentless logic of WW2, to march into that abyss. It is a journey from the deceptive calm of September 1940 through the creeping realization of a long conflict to the frenzied, desperate, total war mobilization declared only when defeat was staring it in the face. To understand Germany's path to total war, we must first dismantle the myth of a seamlessly mobilized Nazi state. The time is Friday, September 1st, 1939, 04:45 hours. German forces crossed the border into Poland, igniting WW2 in Europe. Contrary to the image of a monolithic war machine, Germany's economy in 1939 was not on a full war footing. Since coming to power in 1933, the Nazi regime had pursued aggressive rearmament, but this was done within significant constraints. Hitler and his economic managers, like Hjalmar Schacht and later Hermann Göring, feared a repeat of the collapse of the home front that had occurred in 1918. They were determined to avoid drastic cuts in civilian consumption that could breed popular discontent. The result was a policy of guns and butter. The Wehrmacht was being lavishly equipped for short, sharp wars, while the German people enjoyed a standard of living that was, for many, the highest since the 1920s. This was financed by massive deficit spending, plunder from annexed territories like Austria and Czechoslovakia, and the exploitation of forced labor from concentration camps, which was still relatively small-scale at this point. The administration of this economy was chaotic, a reflection of the Nazi principle of divide and rule. Rival fiefdoms competed for resources, Göring's sprawling 4-year plan organization, the Wehrmacht's **own procurement offices, the SS economic empire, and various state and party bureaucracies. There was no single, rational central planning agency like the one that would emerge in Britain or the United States. Production was plagued by inefficiencies, duplication, and bottlenecks. When the war began, there was no immediate shift. The stunning victory over Poland in September 1939, achieved in just over a month, seemed to validate the Blitzkrieg model, a rapid, professional military strike that did not require full societal mobilization. The period known as the Phony War or Sitzkrieg from October 1939 to April 1940 reinforced this. Life in Germany remained surprisingly normal. Rations for food, clothing, and coal were set at levels designed to be bearable, even comfortable, for the average family. The conquest of Western Europe in the spring and summer of 1940 only deepened this illusion. The loot from defeated nations was immense. Raw materials, industrial equipment, food stocks, and hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war who could be used as agricultural and industrial labor. The captured resources flooded into Germany, artificially sustaining the peacetime war economy. Consumer goods production was deliberately maintained. The regime even lowered some food rations in the immediate aftermath of the French campaign, confident that imports from the occupied territories would make up the difference. The underlying principle was that Germany would fight its wars with the resources of others, sparing its own population. The success of this strategy, however, bred two fatal complacencies. First, it convinced Hitler and the High Command that future wars, particularly the planned invasion of the Soviet Union, could be won swiftly with the existing economic model. Second, it left the German industrial base unprepared for a protracted war of attrition against the combined industrial might of the British Empire, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The decision for Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the USSR, finalized in December 1940, was the ultimate expression of this blitzkrieg asterisk mindset. It was a gamble that the war in the East would be another short, decisive campaign, obviating the need for a painful economic restructuring at home. The early victories of June and July 1941 seemed to confirm this. But by the winter of 1941, with the Wehrmacht frozen before the gates of Moscow, the first cracks in the facade began to appear. The war was not over, it was just beginning, and Germany was not ready. The date is Monday, February 2, 1943. In the ruins of Stalingrad, the last remnants of the German Sixth Army surrender. The news, when it is finally revealed to the German public through a somber radio announcement punctuated by drumrolls, is a profound psychological shock. For the first time, the myth of invincibility is shattered. On the home front, the signs of a lengthening war had been accumulating throughout 1942. The RAF's Bomber Command, now under Arthur Harris, was beginning its area bombing campaign in earnest. The first 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne on the night of May 30, 1942, demonstrated a new scale of destruction. Civilian life was increasingly punctuated by air raid sirens, nights in shelters, and the grim morning task of clearing rubble. Rationing, while still managed to avoid outright starvation, was becoming tighter. Luxury goods vanished, clothing coupons bought less, and ersatz products, synthetic rubber, Buna, coffee made from chicory, textiles from wood pulp became commonplace. The economic response to this creeping crisis was still piecemeal. In February 1942, Hitler had appointed the young, ambitious architect Albert Speer as Minister of Armaments and War Production, following the death of his predecessor, Fritz Todt, in a plane crash. Speer represented a new, technocratic approach. A master organizer and a favorite of Hitler, he set about rationalizing the chaotic war economy. He instituted a system of centralized planning committees for key areas like tanks, aircraft, and ships, bypassing the tangled bureaucracy of the Wehrmacht and the party. He championed industrial self-responsibility, giving factory managers and industrialists greater freedom to innovate and streamline production in exchange for meeting state quotas. He worked to standardize weapon designs, simplifying the vast array of aircraft subtypes. For example, to focus on mass production of key models like the Focke-Wulf FW-190 and later the Messerschmitt Me 262 jet. Speer's reforms yielded impressive statistical gains. Between 1942 and 1944, German production of weapons, ammunition, and equipment soared despite the Allied bombing. Tank production tripled. Aircraft output nearly doubled. This armaments miracle is often cited as evidence of Germany's total war capacity. However, it was still a partial, lopsided mobilization. Speer's genius was in making the existing system more efficient, but he operated within political limits set by Hitler. The Führer, still wary of civilian morale, resisted calls for the full closure of non-essential consumer industries like fashion, ceramics, or fine furniture. Many small shops and workshops remained open, absorbing manpower and resources. The employment of women is a telling indicator. In Britain and the Soviet Union, women flooded into factories, shipyards, and auxiliary military roles. In Nazi Germany, the ideological emphasis on women as mothers and homemakers, Kinder, Kirch, children, kitchen, church, persisted, while many women did work. Especially in family businesses or in roles seen as extensions of the domestic sphere, there was no concerted, state-driven campaign to mobilize female labor on the scale of the Allies, until the very last stages of the war. The regime relied instead on millions of forced laborers from occupied Europe, POWs, civilian deportees, and concentration camp inmates, whose productivity was often low due to brutal conditions and starvation. The period after Stalingrad marked a turning point in perception, not yet in total commitment. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, in a speech at the Berlin Sportpalast on February 18, 1943, famously asked a frenzied crowd, "Do you want total war?" The answer was a roared yes, but the reality fell short. Goebbels's speech was a propaganda masterpiece designed to steel the population for harder times, but it did not immediately translate into the sweeping, draconian measures the term implied. The war was becoming total in its impact on daily life, through bombing, loss, and hardship. But the state's mobilization of its own society remained hesitant, constrained by ideology and the lingering hope that technological wonder weapons or a political breakup of the Allied coalition could still deliver a favorable outcome. The fundamental contradiction remained. Germany was fighting a world war with one hand tied behind its back, trying to preserve a semblance of normalcy while the front lines demanded ever more extreme sacrifices. The date is Tuesday, June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied forces establish a beachhead in Normandy, another front opens in the west, confirming Germany's strategic encirclement. By the summer of 1944, the reality of total war was inescapable for every German citizen. The Allied strategic bombing campaign had reached a catastrophic crescendo. USAAF's daylight precision raids and the RAF's nighttime area attacks now operated in a coordinated round-the-clock offensive dubbed around-the-clock bombing. Cities like Hamburg, Operation Gomorrah, July 1943, had been devastated by firestorms. The relentless pounding of the transportation network, synthetic fuel plants, and ball-bearing factories began to strangle the very production miracle Speer had engineered. Daily life was a struggle for survival amidst ruins. Millions were homeless, living in cellars or being evacuated to the countryside. The black market thrived. The rationing system, though still functioning, provided a bare subsistence diet. On the battlefronts, the news was unrelentingly grim. The colossal defeat at Kursk in July 1943 had broken German offensive power in the east. The Red Army was now advancing westward in a series of massive, crushing offensives. In Italy, the Allies were grinding northward. The home front and the fighting front were merging. Refugees from the east, fleeing the advancing Soviet troops, flooded into the Central Reich, bringing tales of terror and vengeance. For the first time, the war was being fought on German soil. It was in this context of imminent catastrophe that the final, desperate phase of total mobilization was enacted. The architect of this last push was, once again, Joseph Goebbels. Following the July 20, 1944, assassination attempt on Hitler, a wave of hysterical loyalty swept the regime, allowing for the final dismantling of any remaining restraints. On July 25, 1944, Goebbels was appointed plenipotentiary for total war. Now he had the authority to match his rhetoric. A series of draconian decrees were issued. All theaters, music halls, and non-essential businesses were ordered closed. Remaining small businesses and artisan workshops were shuttered, their owners and workers conscripted. The bureaucratic apparatus was ruthlessly combed for re-area swine to be sent to the front or to armaments factories. Leave for soldiers and workers was cancelled. The Hitler Youth and the League of German Girls were mobilized for anti-aircraft duties, clearing rubble and caring for the wounded. The ideological resistance to the full mobilization of women finally collapsed. All women between 17 and 45 were required to register for work assignments. They were deployed in factories, on farms, and in auxiliary military roles like flak helpers. This was total war in its most extreme form, but it came far too late. The economic infrastructure needed to utilize this frantic mobilization was itself being systematically destroyed from the air. New tanks rolled off assembly lines only to be immobilized for lack of fuel. New fighter planes were shot down over their own airfields by swarms of Allied fighters. The manpower scooped up by Goebbels's dragnets was often untrained, poorly equipped, and demoralized. The final levy was the Volkssturm People's Storm, decreed by Hitler on September 25, 1944. This was a national militia of boys as young as 16 and men as old as 60, conscripted for the defense of the Reich. Lacking proper uniforms, often armed with obsolete or captured weapons, and with minimal training, they were thrown into battles against the seasoned troops of the Red Army and the Western Allies, suffering horrific casualties. This was the grotesque endpoint of the march into total war, the sacrifice of children and grandfathers in a futile defense of a regime that was already dead. The time is Monday, May 7, 1945. In a schoolhouse in Reims, France, the German High Command surrenders unconditionally to the Allies. The war in Europe is over. Nazi Germany's experiment with total war ends in absolute physical and moral ruin. The journey from the confident, victorious September of 1940 to the smoldering ashes of 1945 reveals a fundamental truth about the Third Reich. For all its militaristic and social Darwinist ideology, it was a regime deeply afraid of its own people's capacity for discontent. It sought to wage war as an external project, funded by plunder and fought by a professional military, while insulating the Volksgemeinschaft, racial community, from the true costs. This was the core of the Blitzkrieg illusion. When WW II became the protracted, global conflict of attrition its opponents could wage, Germany was caught in a trap of its own making. Its shift to a true total war economy was slow, chaotic, and incomplete, hampered by ideological dogma, administrative rivalry, and the leadership's delusional belief in quick fixes and miracle weapons. By the time it embraced total mobilization in the summer of 1944, it was a hysterical, last-ditch effort that only magnified the suffering without altering the outcome. The German population, subjected to relentless bombing, bereavement, and finally invasion, endured a total war experience by 1944-45, but the state's management of that totality was always reactive, inefficient, and ultimately suicidal. The story of Nazi Germany's march into total war is thus not one of a sleek, efficient machine, but of a fragmented, ideologically blinkered system that was forced by the relentless pressure of a world war it had started, but could not control, to finally demand everything from its people, only when there was nothing left to give. The facade of a streamlined German war machine cracks when we examine the industrial and logistical underpinnings of its war effort. The time is Wednesday, July 15, 1942. Deep within the massive, camouflaged factories of the Reich, workers on double shifts are assembling Panzer IV tanks. The production numbers are rising, a testament to Speer's reorganization. Yet this apparent strength masked profound, systemic weaknesses that the ideology of Blitzkrieg and the practice of plunder had long obscured. Germany's path to total war was not just a story of mobilizing people, but of mobilizing resources, transportation, and technology within a continent under siege. A fundamental and often fatal flaw was Germany's resource poverty in key strategic materials. The Reich was chronically short of oil, rubber, high-grade iron ore, copper, tungsten, and numerous other alloys vital for modern warfare. The early conquests provided a temporary windfall: Romanian oil, Norwegian nickel, French bauxite, Swedish iron ore shipped from Luleå. But these were captive resources, vulnerable to interdiction and insufficient for a long war against global powers. The entire strategic rationale for the 1942 summer offensive, Case Blue, aimed at the Caucasus oil fields, was born of this desperation. The failure to secure them permanently condemned the German military to a fuel crisis that would only deepen. By 1944, the synthetic fuel plants, which produced precious gasoline from coal via the Fischer-Tropsch process, became the #1 target of the USAAF's precision bombing campaign. In May 1944, before D-Day, these raids succeeded in cutting German synthetic fuel output by nearly 90%. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Pilot training was slashed, mechanized divisions were immobilized, and the Luftwaffe could scarcely put planes into the air to contest the skies over Normandy or the Reich itself. A war machine built for mobility was being starved of its very lifeblood. The transportation network, the circulatory system of the war economy, was another critical vulnerability. Germany's railway system, the Reichsbahn was a marvel of engineering, but it was under immense, unsustainable strain. It had to juggle three overwhelming demands: moving troops and supplies to multiple distant fronts, from Norway to North Africa to the Volga, shipping raw materials from occupied territories to German factories, and redistributing finished weapons, coal, and food across the Reich. The system was further crippled by a lack of standardization across Europe. Different rail gauges, signaling systems, and wagon couplings caused endless delays. The locomotive and rolling stock fleet, already overstretched, began to deteriorate from overuse and lack of maintenance. Allied bombing systematically targeted marshalling yards, locomotive works, and key bridges. The repair services performed heroic feats, but by late 1944, the system was nearing collapse. Essential coal shipments from the Ruhr to arms factories were delayed or failed to arrive, creating cascading production stoppages. The transportation breakdown was a silent killer of the German war effort, as decisive as any lost battle. Industrial production itself, despite Speer's miracle, was plagued by deep-seated inefficiencies that a true, early total war mobilization might have addressed. The Nazi state was a chaotic web of competing interests. The Wehrmacht * individual services, the Army * Heer, Air Force * Luftwaffe, and Navy * Kriegsmarine * all maintained their own rival procurement offices, each demanding specialized designs and competing for raw materials, skilled labor, and factory space. The Waffen-SS * Hitler's political army, also developed its own parallel supply channels. This fragmentation led to a staggering proliferation of models and variants. For instance, Germany produced over 425 different types of aircraft during WW II, compared to a much more limited and standardized range in the United States. This complexity hampered mass production, complicated training and maintenance, and strained the spare parts supply chain. While American industry churned out vast numbers of robust, simple designs like the Liberty ship, the Sherman tank, and the P-51 Mustang, German engineering, though often brilliant, tended toward overcomplexity and constant refinement, which slowed output. The Tiger tank was a fearsome weapon, but it was a boutique item, expensive, fuel-thirsty, difficult to transport, and prone to breakdowns. Germany could never hope to match the sheer volume of Allied production. Its only hope was qualitative superiority, but even that edge was blunted by its own industrial disorganization and the enemy's relentless bombing. The role of occupied Europe in this system was double-edged. It was a vital source of plunder, but also a growing liability. Factories in France, Belgium, Bohemia, and Moravia were integrated into the German war economy, producing everything from trucks to aircraft components. However, this integration was exploitative, not collaborative. Resources and finished goods were extracted with little regard for the local economies, breeding resentment and fueling resistance movements that themselves required security forces to suppress. Furthermore, as the tide of war turned, these occupied territories became vulnerable to Allied bombing and eventually liberation, severing those production lines. The reliance on forced and slave labor became more pronounced as the war dragged on. By 1944, over 7 million foreign civilians and POWs, along with hundreds of thousands of concentration camp inmates, toiled in German fields and factories. This workforce was kept in line by brutality and terror. Their productivity was low, sabotage was constant, and they consumed scarce food and housing resources. The Nazi war economy was thus built on a foundation of sand, plundered resources, coerced labor, and a transportation network on the verge of infarction. It was a system capable of impressive short-term output, as Speer proved, but one inherently fragile and incapable of sustaining a prolonged multi-front war against the coordinated industrial titans of the Allied coalition. The march into total war, therefore, was not a march toward greater efficiency, but a desperate stumble deeper into a logistical and resource quagmire. The German home front was not a monolithic block of fanatical Nazis eagerly sacrificing for final victory. It was a complex society under immense and growing pressure, managed by a sophisticated apparatus of propaganda, surveillance, rewards, and terror. Understanding how the regime kept the nation fighting long after rational hope had vanished is key to understanding the nature of its total war. The time is Thursday, January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Hitler's seizure of power. Goebbels is preparing to broadcast his total war speech, but behind the orchestrated fanaticism of the Sportpalast lay a population whose commitment was a mixture of patriotism, fear, habituation, and deepening anxiety. Propaganda was the regime's primary tool for shaping reality. The Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda, under Goebbels, controlled all information: newspapers, radio, film, and public events. Its messages were tailored and evolved with the war. Early on, it focused on glorious victory, the superiority of German arms, and the righteousness of the cause against Jewish Bolshevism and plutocratic capitalism. As the war turned, the narrative shifted. Setbacks were portrayed as temporary, sacrifices as heroic, and the enemy as an inhuman foe bent on the annihilation of the German people. The bombing of cities was framed not as a consequence of the war Germany started, but as terror attacks by barbaric pilots, stiffening resolve rather than breeding defeatism. The promise of wonder weapons, V-1 flying bombs, V-2 rockets, jet aircraft, was dangled before the public in 1943 and 1944 as the certain guarantor of a turn in fortunes. This propaganda was pervasive and, for many, effective. It provided a framework for understanding suffering and a reason to continue. But propaganda alone could not compel obedience. It was backed by a pervasive system of surveillance and terror. The Gestapo, secret state police, and the SD security service of the SS maintained vast networks of informants. Defeatist talk, undermining military strength, or listening to foreign radio broadcasts like the BBC, which was illegal, could lead to arrest, imprisonment in a concentration camp, or execution. The People's Court Volksgerichtshof, under the fanatical judge Roland Freisler, became a theater of humiliation and death for those accused of treason, most visibly after the July 20th plot. Terror was selective but omnipresent. Its purpose was less to punish the masses than to set horrific examples that deterred dissent. The regime understood that most people were not ideologues, but were concerned with the survival and well-being of their families. As long as the state could provide basic security, food, shelter, a sense of order, passive compliance was likely. This compliance was also engineered through a system of rationed rewards and social policy. The Volksgemeinschaft ideology promised a racial community without class conflict. During the war, this translated into efforts to maintain a semblance of fairness in distribution. The rationing system, while increasingly austere, was generally administered with bureaucratic rigor to prevent the gross inequities of World War I that had led to revolution. The Strength Through Joy Kraft durch Freude organization provided limited but symbolically important vacations, concerts, and leisure activities for war workers and soldiers' families. The Winter Relief Winterhilfswerk collections, though coercive, reinforced the message of communal sacrifice. For the loyal, there were tangible rewards: medals for workers, leave for soldiers, preferential housing assignments for bombed-out families of party members. The system created a gradient of privilege and punishment, binding many to the regime through a web of small dependencies and fears. Yet beneath this controlled surface, there was a spectrum of attitudes, from fanaticism to silent opposition. The reports of the SD and the SOPAID, Social Democratic Party in Exile, provide a nuanced picture. After Stalingrad, a grim realism, dubbed catastrophe consciousness by historians, set in among many. People were exhausted, grieving, and fearful, but the lack of a viable alternative, the prospect of unconditional surrender, and the terrifying propaganda image of the Red Army kept most in line. Active resistance, as exemplified by the White Rose student group or the Kreisau Circle, was minuscule and brutally crushed. Far more common was what historians call resistance, everyday acts of non-compliance, hoarding food, bartering on the black market, avoiding Hitler salutes, sharing critical jokes in private, or simply retreating into the private sphere of family. The regime could command outward obedience, but it could not command genuine enthusiasm in the face of nightly bombing raids and death notices. The march into total war was thus accompanied not by a unified national roar, but by the complex, weary shuffle of a population trapped between a vengeful enemy abroad and a terroristic state at home, with the primal instinct for survival as its primary guide. The societal mobilization was, in the end, a forced march. The Nazi conception of total war was fundamentally different from that of its Allied adversaries. For Britain, the Soviet Union, or the United States, total war meant the mobilization of the entire national community, men and women, industry and agriculture, for the defense of the nation and the defeat of an enemy regime. For Nazi Germany, total war was inextricably fused with its core ideological project, a racial war of annihilation and colonization. This ideological imperative did not just accompany the war effort, it actively distorted and undermined it, creating fatal contradictions in Germany's path to total mobilization. The time is Tuesday, October 6, 1942. In the occupied East, SS units are systematically murdering Jewish communities, while economic planners in Berlin desperately seek more workers for German factories. This clash of ideology and pragmatic necessity was at the heart of the Nazi war effort. The most catastrophic manifestation of this was the Holocaust, the systematic murder of European Jewry. The logistical and resource cost of the final solution was staggering. It diverted precious railway rolling stock and scheduling at critical moments, such as during the Stalingrad airlift and the build-up to Kursk, to transport victims to death camps. It required the deployment of thousands of SS personnel, police, and auxiliaries who could have been used at the front. It consumed engineering resources to build and maintain the extermination camps. Most perversely, it annihilated a vast pool of potential labor. As Germany's manpower crisis deepened in 1942-43, some Nazi officials, notably SS Chief of Economic Operations Oswald Pohl, advocated for the extermination through work policy, using concentration camp inmates as slave labor in SS-run factories like the one at Auschwitz Roman III Monowitz. However, the ideological drive for immediate physical annihilation often overrode even this brutal economic logic. The murder of skilled Jewish workers in factories across occupied Europe and the refusal to consider them as a replenishable labor resource was an act of ideological fanaticism that no rational war economy could afford. This racial ideology also crippled the effective use of occupied populations in the East. Nazi policy viewed Slavs as *Untermenschen, subhumans, destined for enslavement, expulsion, or extermination to make way for German settlers. This precluded any attempt to win the cooperation of the millions of Ukrainians, Belarusians, and Russians who initially greeted the Germans as liberators from Stalinist tyranny. Instead of fostering anti-Soviet nationalism, the brutal occupation policy, marked by indiscriminate reprisals, starvation rations, and outright murder, drove these populations into the arms of the partisans. The fierce and growing partisan war behind the Eastern Front, a direct result of this ideology, tied down hundreds of thousands of German security troops, wrecked supply lines, and made the extraction of food and resources from these territories far more difficult and costly. A pragmatic strategy of collaboration could have secured the rear and unlocked vast human and agricultural resources. Nazi ideology made this impossible. Even within the Reich, ideology hampered total mobilization. The obsession with racial purity led to the continued persecution and murder of German citizens deemed life unworthy of life, the Action T4 euthanasia program, and others like Sinti and Roma, wasting lives and medical resources. The regime's view of women primarily as mothers conflicted directly with the need for their labor. Only in the direst emergency in 1944-45 was this reluctantly set aside. Similarly, the Nazi disdain for academic and scientific elitism, unless it served immediate military technology, led to the persecution of Jewish scientists and a failure to fully mobilize theoretical research in areas like nuclear physics until it was far too late. The Allied Manhattan Project, which harnessed the talents of refugees from Axis persecution, stood in stark contrast. In essence, Nazi Germany was fighting two simultaneous and often conflicting wars. The first was a conventional military struggle for hegemony in Europe. The second was an ideological racial war to create a new order. The resources, manpower, and mental energy devoted to the Second War, The Holocaust, the brutal occupation, the internal purges severely drained the first. The regime's inability to prioritize the military struggle over its ideological obsessions was a critical flaw. A purely pragmatic, amoral dictatorship might have mobilized the resources of Europe more effectively and prolonged the war. The Nazi state, however, was incapable of such pragmatism. Its march into total war was therefore a march into a paradox, seeking to mobilize a continent for victory while simultaneously destroying a significant portion of its human capital and alienating the rest through a doctrine of racial hatred. This ideological engine did not power the war machine. It acted as a corrosive agent, eating away at its gears and bearings until the whole apparatus seized up and collapsed. Identifying the precise moment Germany was irrevocably committed to total war is complex, as it was a process, not a single event. However, by examining key transition points, we can see how the illusion of a limited war steadily eroded. The Conference of December 5, 1940, which committed Germany to Operation Barbarossa, was the strategic point of no return, locking it into a two-front war of attrition. But the societal and economic commitment to totality came later, in a series of stuttering, reluctant steps. The winter of 1941-42 stands as the first major pivot. The failure before Moscow and the entry of the United States into the war in December 1941 shattered the blitzkrieg fantasy. This was the moment the war became genuinely global and indefinite. The immediate response was not total mobilization, but the beginning of a deeper economic shift, crystallized in the appointment of Albert Speer in February 1942. Speer's reforms marked the state's recognition that the war would be longer and require greater economic coordination, but they still operated within the constraints of avoiding undue civilian hardship. This was total war light. The true psychological Rubicon for the German public was crossed with the defeat at Stalingrad, announced in February 1943, and Goebbels's subsequent total war speech. For the first time, the propaganda minister explicitly stated the war was existential and demanded extreme measures. While the practical decrees that followed were still limited, the speech was a public baptism into the reality of a fight to the finish. It marked the end of hope for a negotiated peace and the beginning of a societal mentality focused on national survival against a vengeful foe. Yet the most concrete, bureaucratic point of no return for the home front mobilization came in the summer of 1944, in the aftermath of the July 20th plot. The failed assassination provided the pretext for a final, radical purge of any remaining, soft elements in the state and society. Goebbels's appointment as plenipotentiary for total war on July 25, 1944, and the draconian decrees that followed, closing businesses, combing out offices, conscripting women and children, represented the regime's final, desperate lunge into full mobilization. This was no longer Speer's rationalizing efficiency drive. It was a scorched earth policy applied to the home front itself. It was the admission that every human and material resource, no matter how marginal, must now be consumed in the defense of the regime. The creation of the Volkssturm in September 1944 was the symbolic capstone of this process. The state now claimed the right to spend the lives of its youngest and oldest male citizens. From this point onward, there was no longer any distinction between soldier and civilian, front and homeland. The war had become total in its most complete and horrific sense, but it was a totality born of despair, not strength, and it served only to protract the agony. The clock reads 23:01 on Monday, May 7, 1945, in Reims. The German surrender has been signed. The journey that began with the triumphant, seemingly low-cost victories of 1940 ends here, in the heart of a destroyed continent. Nazi Germany's march into total war was a story of profound contradiction and failure. It was a regime that glorified war and willpower, but feared the political consequences of fully demanding that willpower from its people until it was far too late. It built a formidable military machine, but shackled it to an economic model based on plunder and a logistical system it could not sustain. It sought to conquer a continent, but was undone by an ideological program that made rational exploitation of its conquests impossible. Compared to the Allies, Germany's total war was always incomplete, hesitant, and fatally delayed. The Soviet Union, from June 1941, mobilized with a terrifying, brutal totality, moving its industry, throwing millions into battle, and sacrificing everything for survival. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, its economy effortlessly outpacing the Axis in a breathtaking display of industrialized warfare, all while maintaining its civilian living standards. Britain mobilized its society and empire with remarkable cohesion and fairness under the strain of the Blitz. Germany, by contrast, stumbled into totality. Its mobilization was reactive, not proactive, fragmented, not unified, and undermined by its own racist ideology. The much-vaunted total war proclaimed in 1943 was more propaganda than reality. The actual frenzied total mobilization of 1944-45 was not the cause of its prolonged resistance, but a symptom of its impending doom, a death spasm, not a strategy. In the end, the Third Reich proved incapable of waging the very kind of war its ideology seemed to demand. It could start a world war, but it could not organize its society to win one. The German people endured a total war experience by 1945, but the state that led them there had mismanaged that totality at every turn. The rubble of Berlin, Cologne, and Hamburg stood not as monuments to a formidable war effort, but as tombstones for a regime whose greatest failure, beyond its moral bankruptcy, was its catastrophic and incoherent mismanagement of the very concept of total war. Thank you for watching.